Welcome aboard. And I mean that quite literally, because today we are not simply going to talk about an aircraft. We are going to step inside one. We are going to walk its corridors, press our faces against its extraordinary windows, feel the low vibration of its four engines humming through the floor beneath our feet, and sit in a cabin that, by any reasonable measure, should not have existed in 1930. Not in 1930. Not in any decade that came before it. And yet, here it was. Enormous, silent in ways that defied expectation, elegant in ways that defied engineering, and utterly unlike anything the world had ever seen in the sky. Let me ask you something before we begin. When you think about the golden age of flight, what do you imagine? A sleek, propeller-driven machine threading through clouds, or a uniformed steward offering a tray of champagne, a window seat over the Atlantic with a white tablecloth and silverware catching the afternoon light? Those images are real, and they belong to a remarkable era. But what if I told you that long before any of those scenes became the standard portrait of luxury air travel, there existed a German aircraft so large, so architecturally ambitious, and so philosophically different from everything before or after it, that passengers did not merely sit inside the fuselage? They sat inside the wings. They walked into the leading edge of a wing that was thick enough to contain a cabin. They looked out through forward-facing windows that placed them, quite literally, at the very nose of an aircraft that stretched wider than many of the airport buildings it visited. They were, in every meaningful sense, flying inside the wing itself. This is the story of the Junkers G.38, and I promise you, it is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of aviation. Stay with me, because this is where the journey begins. Imagine for a moment that you are standing on the apron of Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. The year is 1931. The air smells of engine oil and morning mist. Around you, a small crowd has gathered, not because crowds were unusual at Tempelhof, but because something has appeared on the field that stops conversation in its tracks. It is too large. Your eyes struggle to make sense of its proportions. You are accustomed to aircraft that look like elongated birds, narrow and purposeful, with wings extending out from a central body. What you are looking at now does not follow that logic. The wings are not an extension of the aircraft. The wings are the aircraft. The fuselage, if you can even call it that, seems almost secondary, a spine running through the center of something that is primarily, overwhelmingly, a wing that stands as tall as a small building at its center section, a wing wide enough that a grown man can walk fully upright inside its leading edge, a wing that hides within it a passenger cabin with windows facing forward into the sky ahead. The Junkers G.38 had a wingspan of 44 meters. 44 meters. For context, a modern Boeing 737, the aircraft you likely flew on most recently, has a wingspan of approximately 36 meters. This German machine, built in 1929, was wider than aircraft that would fly 50 years later. It weighed, when fully loaded, over 23 tons. It was powered by 4 engines, 2 on the leading edge of the wing, 2 buried inside the wing itself, and driving propellers through extended shafts, an arrangement that gave the aircraft an eerie, almost otherworldly sound profile inside the cabin. And it could carry, depending on configuration, somewhere between 30 and 40 passengers in conditions that the German airline Lufthansa, which operated the aircraft, described without the slightest exaggeration as the most spacious and comfortable flying environment available anywhere in the world. This is where one begins to understand that this was a different way of traveling. To fully appreciate what the Junkers G.38 represented, you have to understand who Hugo Junkers was and what he believed about aviation. Because the G.38 was not simply a large aircraft. It was the physical expression of a philosophy. A statement made in aluminum and engineering about what flight could and should become. Hugo Junkers was born in 1859 in Reit, in what was then the Kingdom of Prussia. He was, by any measure, one of the most original engineering minds of his generation. He spent decades working in thermodynamics, in gas appliances, in engines and boilers, accumulating both knowledge and patents with a methodical, restless energy. But it was aviation that became his obsession, and when he turned his attention to the sky, he did so with a set of ideas that were almost scandalously ahead of his time. Junkers believed in the all-metal aircraft at a moment when most of the world was still building planes from wood and fabric. He believed in the cantilever monoplane wing, a wing that derived its structural strength from its own internal engineering rather than from external bracing wires, at a time when biplanes with elaborate wire rigging were considered the only sensible way to build a flying machine. And he believed, most radically of all, in the thick wing, not the thin, knife-like wing profile that most designers favored, but a wing deep and voluminous enough to be structural, load-bearing in the fullest sense, capable of housing fuel, engines, and eventually passengers. His earliest all-metal aircraft, the Junkers J, one of 1915, was a revelation and a curiosity in equal measure. By the early 1920s, his Dessau factory was producing some of the most advanced commercial aircraft in Europe. The Junkers F-13, a small all-metal monoplane, became the world's first purpose-built commercial passenger aircraft. It flew the mail, it flew passengers, it flew into places that other aircraft could not reach, and it did so with a structural integrity and reliability that established Junkers as the gold standard of German aviation engineering. But Hugo Junkers was not interested in small. He was interested in the logical endpoint of his thick wing philosophy. If a wing could be made thick enough to carry structural loads, thick enough to house engines, thick enough to contain fuel tanks, then why not thick enough to carry passengers? Why not a wing so enormous, so fundamentally inhabitable that the distinction between wing and fuselage became meaningless? Why not an aircraft that was, in essence, a flying wing? That vision led, step by step, and over years of development and experimentation, to the G.38. The aircraft that rolled out of the Junkers factory in Dessau in 1929 was unlike anything that had ever flown. Its formal designation was the Junkers G.38, and its design was rooted in a concept that Junkers engineers had been developing throughout the 1920s under the general heading of Großflugzeug, which translates simply as large aircraft, though the word carries a weight and ambition that the translation cannot fully convey. The Germans, in the 1920s, were thinking about large aircraft not merely as a practical solution to carrying more passengers, but as a civilizational statement. A large aircraft was evidence of technological mastery, of industrial ambition, of a nation rebuilding its identity and its international standing through engineering and commerce. Germany had been stripped of its military aviation by the Treaty of Versailles. What it retained, what it poured its aeronautical talent into, was civil aviation. And civil aviation, under those circumstances, became something it has rarely been before or since, genuinely, deeply, emotionally important. Lufthansa, the German national airline, understood this. The airline had been formed in 1926 through the merger of Deutsche Lufthansa and several smaller carriers, and it operated from the beginning with an almost missionary sense of purpose. It flew routes that other airlines considered impractical or unprofitable. It invested in night flying, in instrument flying, in the infrastructure of a modern air network. And when Junkers came to it with the concept of the G.38, on an aircraft that would be the largest commercial land plane in the world, an aircraft that would embody German aviation ambition in a single overwhelming form, Lufthansa commissioned it with genuine enthusiasm. 2 aircraft were ultimately built. The first, registered D-2000 and later named Deutschland, made its first flight on November 6, 1929. The second, registered DAPIS and named General Feldmarschall von Hindenburg, followed in 1931. Both served on Lufthansa's prestige European routes, primarily Berlin to London and Berlin to Rome, carrying a small number of fortunate passengers in circumstances that contemporaries struggled to describe without reaching for the vocabulary of ocean liner travel or luxury hotel accommodation. The comparison was not accidental. It was precisely what Junkers and Lufthansa intended. Can you imagine boarding an aircraft and finding this? You arrive at the aircraft not through a jetway. Naturally, there are no jetways in 1931, but by walking across the apron, and the first thing that strikes you as you approach is scale. The sheer, almost architectural scale of the thing. The central section of the wing, the part that contains the passenger cabins, stands roughly 5.5 meters tall at its deepest point. That is the height of a 2-story building. You are not looking at a vehicle in the conventional sense. You are looking at a structure that happens to fly. You board through a door in the lower section of the fuselage, and a steward, because Lufthansa operated its G.38 services with full cabin crew, guides you to your seat. There are multiple cabin options, and your choice of seat defines the nature of your experience in ways that no other aircraft in the world can offer, before or since. The conventional passenger seats, if you can call anything about this aircraft conventional, are located in the main fuselage section. They are wide, comfortable, upholstered in quality materials, with generous legroom that would be considered exceptional on any aircraft of any era. The windows are large by the standards of the time. The noise levels are lower than you would expect, partly because of the aircraft's size and structural mass, and partly because the engines are mounted ahead of and within the wing, their sound travelling differently than on aircraft where the engines hang directly beside the passenger cabin. Lufthansa-served meals, real meals, are prepared with the kind of care that the airline considered appropriate for its flagship route. Hot food, proper tableware, the kind of service that acknowledged you had paid a significant sum for your seat, and that your comfort was the airline's responsibility. But the seats in the main fuselage are not the point. They are not why historians and aviation enthusiasts speak of the G.38 with a kind of reverence that borders on the devotional. The point, the extraordinary, almost hallucinatory point, is what Junkers had built into the wing itself. This is where the story becomes genuinely unlike anything else. The Junkers G.38's wing was not simply thick. It was architecturally thick, structurally thick in a way that opened up interior volumes that no aircraft designer before or since has exploited in quite the same manner. At the root of the wing, where it joined the central fuselage section, the wing was deep enough to contain cabins. Not storage bays, not mechanical spaces. Actual passenger cabins, with seats, with windows, with upholstery and light, and the full accoutrements of civil air travel as Lufthansa understood it. In the leading edge of each wing route, Junkers engineers installed a forward-facing cabin. Forward-facing. Think about what that means for a moment. A passenger seated in the wing cabin of the Junkers G.38 was not looking out through a window in the side of the fuselage, watching the landscape scroll past at a respectful distance. That passenger was looking forward, out through windows set into the very leading edge of the wing, facing directly in the direction of travel, watching the sky open ahead of them as the aircraft moved through it. The perspective was unlike anything available on any other aircraft. You were not a passenger looking out a window. You were, in every experiential sense, at the front of the aircraft, enclosed within the wing, moving through the air as if the air were parting specifically for you. There were additional windows in the lower surface of the wing, looking downward, offering a view of the landscape below that was, by every account that survives from passengers who made this journey, literally breathtaking. You could look straight down through the floor of your cabin and see the ground far below, the rivers and fields and cities of Europe passing beneath you with a clarity and immediacy that no conventional window seat could provide. The earth was not beside you or behind you. It was below you, visible through the structure you were sitting inside, as if the wing itself had become transparent. The most surprising thing is that this really happened. Each wing route cabin could accommodate a small number of passengers, typically 2 or 4 depending on configuration, seated in chairs that were, in the photographs that survive, unmistakably luxurious. Wide armchairs, proper upholstery, the proportions of a private compartment rather than a mass transit seat. You were not sharing this experience with dozens of strangers. You were in what amounted to a private observatory, suspended inside the wing of the largest commercial aircraft in the world, watching the sky and the earth with an intimacy and immediacy that has never been replicated. Lufthansa understood perfectly what it had. The wing cabins were premium accommodation offered to the airline's most valued passengers and described in the airline's own promotional materials with language that leaned heavily on the vocabulary of exclusivity and wonder. To travel in the wing of the G.38 was not merely to fly. It was to have an experience that was simply not available anywhere else on Earth. Now let us talk about what the journey actually felt like from the moment the engines began to turn. The G.38 was powered by 4 engines, and their startup sequence was itself an event. The aircraft used a mix of engine types in its service life, but the configuration that Lufthansa eventually standardized on included Junkers Jumo engines of considerable power, and the process of bringing all 4 to life was a prolonged, deeply theatrical business. First one, then another, then the others in succession, each engine adding its voice to a chord of mechanical sound that grew in volume and authority until the entire aircraft was vibrating with contained energy. If you were in the wing cabin, you were positioned close to the inboard engines, and the sensation was not noise exactly, but presence. A deep, physical thrumming that you felt in your chest and in the soles of your feet. A reminder that you were not in a building but in a machine, and that the machine was alive. Taxiing to the runway, the G.38 moved with a deliberate, stately pace that was entirely in keeping with its dimensions. Ground crews stepped aside. Other aircraft gave way. There was something almost processional about its movements, a quality that passengers noticed and remarked upon. You were aboard something that commanded the landscape around it simply by existing within it. The takeoff run was long by the standards of the era, as you would expect from an aircraft of this weight, and the acceleration was gradual, almost regal. The G.38 did not leap into the sky. It committed to the sky with the measured confidence of something that understood its own mass and its own capability. The wheels left the ground gently, the aircraft climbing with a solidity that smaller planes could not match, and the vibration from the runway surface disappeared, replaced by the smooth, insulated quality of flight in an aircraft large enough to absorb the air's small irregularities without transmitting them to passengers. Inside the wing cabin, the transition from ground to air was experienced as a kind of revelation. The windows, which had been showing you taxiways and grass and the backs of other aircraft, now filled with sky. The forward-facing windows showed you only air, blue or grey or white with cloud depending on the day, and the downward-facing windows in the floor showed you the earth beginning to fall away. The city below you shrank. The roads and rooftops became a pattern, then a texture, then an abstraction. The horizon expanded, and you were doing all of this from inside a wing, from within the leading edge of a structure that was simultaneously the roof above you and the floor beneath you, and the reason you were in the sky at all. Can you imagine what it felt like to experience that for the first time in 1931, when the very concept of being airborne was still exotic to most people? The routes that the G.38 flew were among the most prestigious in Lufthansa's network. Berlin to London, Berlin to Rome. Occasionally other European destinations of equivalent commercial and diplomatic weight. These were not budget routes. They were not routes for travelers who needed to get somewhere cheaply or quickly. They were routes for people who traveled in the consciousness that the journey itself was an occasion, that the manner of arrival was as important as the fact of it, that to step from an aircraft like the G.38 onto the apron at Croydon Airport outside London, or at Rome's Littorio airport, was to make a statement about who you were and how you moved through the world. The passengers who booked seats on the G.38 were, by and large, people of considerable means and considerable standing. Industrialists and senior government officials, diplomats on missions of some delicacy, journalists important enough to be treated as dignitaries, the occasional film star or aristocrat whose presence in the passenger manifest was noted in the society columns. These were people accustomed to first-class travel on ocean liners and in railway carriages de luxe. They had reference points for luxury. They knew what quality felt like, and they described their experiences aboard the G.38 in terms that make clear the aircraft met and occasionally exceeded their expectations, which is saying a very great deal. The food is worth dwelling on for a moment because it represents something important about the philosophy of the service. Lufthansa in this era did not treat in-flight catering as a logistics problem, it treated it as a hospitality opportunity. Hot meals were served. The aircraft carried a galley, and the galley was staffed and equipped to produce the kind of food that the airline's premium passengers expected. The table settings were proper. The serving was attentive. The experience of eating aboard the G.38 was designed to remind you not that you were in an aircraft, but that you were in a dining room that happened to be airborne. This distinction mattered enormously to passengers who had grown up associating refinement with stillness, with the stable world of dining rooms and ship salons, and who were still, in 1931, making their peace with the idea that genuine comfort and the experience of flight were not mutually exclusive. This is where one begins to understand that this was a different way of traveling. The noise, or rather the relative absence of it, deserves its own consideration, because one of the persistent complaints about air travel, from its earliest commercial days right through to the present, has been the noise. The constant wearing, cognitively exhausting noise of engines at proximity, transmitted through the airframe into the cabin, making conversation difficult and relaxation elusive. The G.38 was not silent. No piston-engined aircraft of its era was silent. But its size, its mass, its structural depth, and the arrangement of its engines all contributed to a noise environment inside the cabin that contemporaries consistently described as remarkably, surprisingly manageable. Conversations could be held at normal volume. You did not need to shout. You did not need to lean toward your companion and cup your hand around your mouth to be understood. You could speak, and be heard, and respond, and conduct the normal social rituals of travel in something approaching the manner you would in a railway compartment. The wing cabins were particularly noted for their acoustic qualities. Positioned as they were within the structural mass of the wing itself, insulated by the aluminum and engineering around them, passengers in the leading-edge cabins experienced a sound environment that was, by the standards of 1930s aviation, almost meditative. The engine vibration was present, but transformed into something lower, more constant, less intrusive. A hum rather than a roar, a pulse rather than an assault. In that quiet, in those extraordinary forward-facing seats, some passengers wrote. Letters, in the main, because this was the age of correspondence, and arriving somewhere with letters ready to be posted was a form of efficiency that busy people valued. Others read newspapers, books, the documents of commerce and government that justified the expense of the journey. A few, by their own accounts, simply sat and watched the sky ahead of them through those impossible forward windows, watching Europe arrange and rearrange itself below the downward panels of glass, thinking whatever thoughts come to a person suspended inside a wing over a continent. What would you have done in that cabin? What would have occupied your mind in that singular silence above the clouds? I want to pause here and tell you something about the way the G.38 was perceived by the broader world, because it illuminates a great deal about the cultural moment the aircraft inhabited and, in some ways, helped to create. The 1930s were, in aviation terms, a decade of almost violent acceleration. The technology was moving faster than the culture could process it. Aircraft that were considered extraordinary in 1929 were obsolete by 1935. The speeds were increasing, the ranges were extending, the reliability was improving, the passenger numbers were growing. The world was becoming smaller at a pace that people found alternately exhilarating and unnerving. In this context, the G.38 represented something unusual. Not speed, not range, not efficiency in the conventional sense, but scale and experience. It was a bet that what passengers most wanted from flight was not simply to arrive, but to travel. A bet that the journey mattered. A bet that the interior world of the aircraft was as important as the exterior capability of the machine. This bet was not wrong, inexactly. But it was perhaps premature, and it pointed toward a fundamental tension that would run through the history of commercial aviation for the next several decades, a tension between the aircraft as transport and the aircraft as environment, between getting there and being there, between the journey as a cost to be minimized and the journey as an experience to be savored. The G.38 landed emphatically on one side of that tension. It said, with every design decision, with every premium seat and every forward-facing window and every properly laid table, that the journey was the point. That being airborne in comfort and elegance and wonder was not a luxury, but the natural state of a civilization confident enough in its technology to use it beautifully rather than merely efficiently. For a few brief years, on a handful of European routes, that vision was real. It flew, it carried passengers, it delivered its extraordinary promise. Let us spend some time with the aircraft's technical reality, because understanding what Junkers actually achieved in engineering terms makes the experience all the more remarkable. The G.38's wing was a monoplane design with a thickness-to-chord ratio that would have been considered excessive by many of Junkers' contemporaries. The wing was deep at the root, tapering as it extended outboard, and its structural engineering was a direct descendant of the corrugated aluminum construction method that Junkers had been developing and refining since the early days of all-metal aircraft building. The corrugated outer skin, which gives Junkers aircraft of this era their distinctive, almost industrial appearance in photographs, was not an aesthetic choice, but a structural one. The corrugations added rigidity without excessive weight, allowing Junkers to build large structures that were both strong and light by the standards of the time. Inside the wing, the structure was a complex arrangement of spars and ribs and frames that had to simultaneously bear the aerodynamic loads of flight, contain the fuel required for extended operations, provide mounts and access for the inboard engines and their drive shafts, and create the habitable spaces in the wing roots that were the aircraft's most spectacular feature. The fact that Junkers engineers managed to do all of this, with the materials and the computational tools available in the late 1920s, without computer-aided design, without finite element analysis, without any of the tools that modern aerospace engineers take for granted, is a genuine achievement of the highest order. The four engines were arranged in two pairs. The outboard engines were mounted on the leading edge of the wing in a conventional nacelle arrangement, their propellers turning in open air. The inboard engines, however, were buried inside the wing, driving their propellers through long extension shafts that passed forward through the wing structure to nacelles on the leading edge. This arrangement was complex, mechanically demanding, and required careful engineering to ensure that the drive shafts performed reliably through the temperature variations and structural flexure of actual flight. But it had a crucial advantage from the passenger perspective. It moved more of the engine noise and vibration away from the cabin spaces in the wing roots, contributing to that quality of relative quiet that passengers noticed and valued. The aircraft flew at a cruising altitude that, by modern standards, seems modest, typically between 1,000 and 2,000 meters, rarely more. This was partly a limitation of the unpressurized cabin, and partly a reflection of the operating philosophy of the era, which generally preferred routes that kept aircraft close enough to the ground to navigate visually and to land reasonably quickly if something went wrong. At those altitudes, the landscape below was vivid and detailed. The downward windows in the wing floor were not looking at an abstract patchwork of geometric shapes at 35,000 feet. They were looking at a living, legible Europe. The rooftops of cities you recognized, the courses of rivers you had crossed on land, the pattern of fields and forests that you knew from the ground, now revealed in a perspective that was intimate rather than remote. The most surprising thing is that this really happened, and that the people who experienced it could not find adequate words for it, no matter how hard they tried. Let me tell you about a specific journey, not from a particular passenger diary, because the documentary record of individual G.38 passenger experiences is, like so much from this era, fragmentary and incomplete, but reconstructed from the accounts that do survive. They differ from the descriptions in aviation journals, from the promotional texts that Lufthansa published, and from the photographs, those extraordinary photographs that show the wing cabins occupied by passengers in their traveling clothes, sitting in their wide upholstered chairs, looking out through the forward windows with expressions that can only be described as a kind of transported contentment. It is a morning in the early 1930s. Berlin is cool and overcast, as Berlin so often is in any season. You have come to Tempelhof by car, your luggage handled by staff who have seen to it that everything is loaded efficiently and without fuss. The check-in procedure is brief, as befits an aircraft that carries only a few dozen passengers. You know some of them. Lufthansa's G.38 clientele was small enough and exclusive enough that regulars tended to recognize one another across routes and seasons. Nods are exchanged. There is perhaps a brief conversation with a fellow traveler about the weather, about business, about the reliability of the service, which is, in truth, remarkably good for the era. You have booked a wing cabin. This was not an inexpensive choice. The G.38 service was not an inexpensive choice at all, but the wing cabin represented a premium on the premium, a decision that signaled not merely the means to fly, but the understanding that flying like this was a distinct and irreplaceable category of experience. You have made this journey before, perhaps, on a conventional aircraft. You know what it is to fly over Europe with a window seat in a standard fuselage. This is something else. The steward guides you forward and inward, through the aircraft's interior toward the wing route cabin, and the moment you enter it you are struck by how different the space feels. The ceiling is the underside of the wing structure above you. The floor incorporates those extraordinary downward-facing windows, currently covered, as they sometimes were for taxiing, but about to be revealed. The forward wall, which is also the leading edge of the wing, has a pair of windows that face directly ahead into the grey Berlin morning. You are sitting, quite literally, in the nose of the wing, not at the nose of the fuselage, inside the wing. The engines begin. First one, then the others. The vibration is there, as always, but it reaches you attenuated, filtered through the mass around you, less a sound than a sensation, or a deep awareness that something enormous and powerful is waking up. The aircraft begins to move, and through the forward windows you watch Tempelhof's apron slide past, the terminal building drifting by, the other aircraft, smaller than they have any right to be from this perspective, passing out of your field of view. The takeoff. The runway unspools ahead of you through the forward windows, and for a moment you are looking at what the aircraft is looking at, the perspective entirely unlike anything a passenger window in a fuselage wall can offer. You are facing the direction of travel. You are watching the world rush toward you and then drop away. And then the wheels leave the ground, the runway ends, and there is only sky. The floor windows are opened. Below you, falling steadily away, is Berlin. The streets are already becoming a map. The geometry of blocks and avenues, and the dark ribbon of the Spree winding through it. You are watching your city from inside a wing, from within a structure made of aluminum and ambition and the conviction that this was simply how people of refinement should travel. The sky ahead of you is beginning to lighten. The aircraft is climbing toward its cruising altitude, and the landscape below is clarifying as the early haze thins. You are traveling to London. The journey will take several hours, and every one of those hours will be spent in this cabin, in this chair, with this view, with this extraordinary sensation of being carried inside the wing itself across the face of Europe. The steward appears with coffee. Real coffee, in a proper cup, served on a tray with the small attentions of genuine hospitality. Outside the forward windows, the sky is turning from grey to a pale, luminous blue. Below the floor, Germany is arranging itself in its autumn colours, the forests dark, the fields pale, the roads threading through it all with the purposeful elegance of a civilization that believes in going places. You think, I cannot believe this is real. I cannot believe this is where I am, and how I am getting there. And you are right. It is extraordinary, and it will not last. The story of why the G-38 disappeared is, like so many stories of extraordinary things, a story of the world moving in a direction the extraordinary thing was not designed for. By the mid-1930s, the commercial aviation landscape was changing fast. The Douglas DC-2 and then the immortal DC-3 were establishing a new paradigm. Aircraft that were fast, economical, reliable, and relatively comfortable, and carrying more passengers than the G-38 at higher speeds, over similar ranges at significantly lower operating costs. The economics of commercial aviation were beginning to assert themselves with the kind of ruthless logic that has never subsequently loosened its grip on the industry. Airlines needed aircraft that made money, and making money meant filling seats efficiently and keeping operating costs low. The G-38 was not designed for that world. It was designed for a world in which the experience of flight was its own justification, in which the passenger willing to pay for the wing cabin was a customer worth cultivating regardless of the cost, in which the aircraft as architectural achievement and social statement was considered a legitimate aspiration for a national airline. That world existed briefly in the early 1930s, but it existed because Germany was rebuilding its international identity through aviation, because Lufthansa had the ambition and the institutional backing to pursue prestige as well as profit, and because the alternatives were not yet sufficiently compelling to make the G-38's approach look unreasonable. By the later 1930s, those conditions had changed. The Douglas aircraft were available. German manufacturers were developing faster, more modern designs. The operational demands of an expanding Lufthansa network favored flexibility and efficiency over singular grandeur. The G-38's large size, which had been an asset in terms of passenger experience, became a liability in terms of airport infrastructure. Not every airport in the network could handle its dimensions and weight comfortably. Its relatively low speed meant that on competitive routes, passengers could get where they were going faster on newer aircraft. And as commercial aviation matured, the attitude that the journey was the destination was increasingly replaced by the attitude that the destination was the destination, and the journey was the price you paid to get there. The first G-38, Deutschland, had already been written off following a runway accident in 1936. The aircraft ground-looped during landing and suffered damage that, given the aircraft's age and the changing economics of the fleet, Lufthansa decided not to repair. It was broken up. The extraordinary wing cabins, the forward-facing windows, the downward glass floor panels, the entire physical instantiation of that extraordinary experience. Gone. The second aircraft. General Feldmarschall von Hindenburg continued to fly, but the clouds gathering over Europe were not merely meteorological. The political transformation of Germany under National Socialism was reshaping everything, including the airline that had been the G-38's patron and champion. Lufthansa under the Third Reich was a different institution from Lufthansa under the Weimar Republic, differently motivated, differently managed, differently positioned in relation to the state and its ambitions. The G.38 did not belong to that world any more than it had belonged to the world of cheap, efficient, modern air transport. When the war began in September 1939, the second G.38 was pressed into military service. It was assigned to transport duties, stripped of its extraordinary passenger interior. It reduced from a floating salon to a utility vehicle for a military machine that had no use for forward-facing wing cabins and properly laid dining tables. It flew military missions in the Norwegian campaign in the early stages of the conflict, carrying personnel and equipment on routes that bore no resemblance to the Berlin-London service where it had been created. And then, on June 16, 1940, the second and last Junkers G.38 was destroyed. It was attacked and shot down by British fighter aircraft over Crete during the Greek campaign. The aircraft that had carried diplomats and industrialists and journalists across a peaceful Europe in the company of stewards and proper coffee and views through wing-embedded windows was gone. There were no survivors. The most surprising thing is not that it ended this way. The most surprising thing is that it existed at all. There is a larger story inside the story of the G.38, and it is worth taking a moment to consider it, because it touches on something fundamental about the relationship between aviation and civilization, and about what is lost when the extraordinary becomes ordinary, or simply disappears. The Junkers G.38 was, in a very real sense, a road not taken. Not a dead end exactly, because the knowledge and experience accumulated in its design and operation fed into subsequent developments in aviation engineering. But a philosophical road not taken, a vision of what commercial air travel could be that was never fully pursued to its conclusion, that was set aside in favor of a different vision, one that ultimately led to the world we fly in today. The world we fly in today is remarkable in its own way. It is safe beyond anything that the passengers of 1931 could have imagined. It is fast, connecting any 2 points on Earth in hours. It is accessible, carrying billions of people each year at prices that would have seemed impossibly low to the travelers who booked their seats on the G.38. These are genuine achievements, not to be minimized or mocked. But they come at a cost. The cost is that flying, for most people in most circumstances, has become an experience to be endured rather than an occasion to be savored. The aircraft is a tube. The seats are adjacent to the windows rather than inside them. The food is a service to be delivered rather than a hospitality to be extended. The journey is the price of the destination, and the price is expected to be as low as possible, which means that comfort, space, beauty, and wonder are luxuries rather than defaults. The G.38 proposed a different calculation. It said, the price of the journey should include the experience of the journey. It said, if you are going to be suspended in the sky between two great cities, you should be in a place worthy of that suspension. It said, the human desire for wonder, for perspective, for the specific, unrepeatable sensation of watching the world from inside a wing is a legitimate need, and it is worth building for. For a few years, in a few wing cabins above a pre-war Europe that was already beginning to darken at the edges, that calculation was real. The aircraft flew. The passengers sat in their extraordinary chairs. The forward windows showed the sky opening ahead. The floor windows showed the earth falling away beneath. The coffee was served in proper cups. And then the world moved on, as it does, leaving behind the record of an experience so unusual and so specific that even today, nearly a century later, it is difficult to contemplate without a distinct sense of loss for something you never had and can never recover. I want to tell you about the small details, because in the history of luxury travel, the small details are often where the truth lives. Not in the grand claims of the brochure, but in the texture of the actual experience, the things that passengers noticed and remembered because they were unexpected or because they were simply, quietly, perfectly right. The light in the wing cabins. The G.38 flew mostly in daytime, on routes between European capitals whose schedules were designed around normal business hours. The light that entered through the forward and downward windows was, depending on the season and the hour, extraordinary in quality. The forward windows, facing in the direction of travel, caught the light of the sky ahead rather than the ground beside. In morning flights heading west from Berlin, those windows caught the light climbing behind you, while the sky before you was still deep and clear. In afternoon flights, the light came into the cabin at an angle that cast long shadows across the upholstery and the floor panels, a quality of illumination that no architect of a ground-based building could quite replicate. Because the light was not coming from a fixed point relative to the building, but moving, subtly, constantly, as the aircraft tracked its course and the sun shifted in its arc. The sound of the engines, I heard from inside the wing, had a quality that some passengers described as musical. This is not as fanciful as it might sound. The 4 engines of the G.38, running at their normal cruise settings, produced a chord of mechanical frequencies that the wing's structure filtered and shaped in ways that a more conventional aircraft did not. The corrugated aluminum, the deep structural frames, the enclosed volume of the wing root cabin all acted as a kind of acoustic environment, and the result was a sound that had rhythm and depth without the chaotic edge of noise experienced at close quarters in a smaller, more lightly built aircraft. The smell. This is almost never mentioned in the formal records, but it matters because smell is the sense most directly connected to memory and emotional response. The interior of the G.38, like all aircraft of its era, smelled of metal and leather and engine oil, and above all of altitude. That particular quality of air at cruising height, clean and slightly thin and cold, in a way that no ground-level air quite manages. Passengers who had flown before knew that smell and associated it with departure, with the act of leaving the familiar behind. In the wing cabins, surrounded by the structural mass of the aircraft on 3 sides, the smell was different again, mixed with the particular metallic quality of aluminum at temperature, a smell that no passenger in a modern aircraft ever encounters, and that would have told you unmistakably that you were somewhere genuinely unusual. The view at night, on the rare occasions when the G.38 flew after dark, was a completely different experience again. The G.38 was not primarily a night aircraft, but it made evening departures from time to time, and passengers who experienced it spoke of sitting in the wing cabin after dark, with the forward windows showing nothing but the occasional light on the ground far below, the navigation lights of the aircraft itself casting faint illumination on the leading edge of the wing, visible through the side panels. The sensation of moving through complete darkness at speed, enclosed in light and warmth, while the world outside the glass was nothing but night. These are the details that remind you this was not a machine, or not only a machine. It was an environment, carefully considered, genuinely invested in the quality of the experience it offered, believing that the people inside it deserved something more than merely transport. It is worth asking why no one, in the nearly century since the G.38 flew, has replicated its most distinctive feature: the wing cabin. The forward-facing passenger position inside the leading edge of the wing, the downward observation panels in the floor. The answer is partly technological and partly economic, but it is also partly philosophical. Technologically, the progression of aviation after the Second World War moved decisively away from thick-wing, low-speed designs toward thin-wing, high-speed, high-altitude configurations. The pressurized fuselage became the standard, carrying passengers in a sealed tube at altitudes where the wing's internal volume, even if accessible, would be a frozen, oxygen-depleted environment rather than a comfortable observation lounge. The wing became aerodynamically thinner, more efficient at high speed, entirely uninhabitable. The very feature that Junkers had exploited so brilliantly, the thick, slow wing with its internal volume, was incompatible with the direction aviation chose to travel. Economically, the post-war expansion of commercial aviation was predicated on seat count and load factor. More seats, filled more reliably, at lower fares, reaching more destinations. A wing cabin that accommodated 4 passengers in extraordinary comfort was, from this perspective, a catastrophically inefficient use of airframe volume. Every square meter given over to a passenger experience needed to generate revenue proportional to its cost, and the mathematics of a forward observation lounge for a handful of premium passengers simply did not pencil out in an industry increasingly structured around mass-market economics. And philosophically, the belief that drove the G.38's design, the belief that the journey mattered as much as the destination, that the experience of being airborne in comfort and wonder was its own justification, was simply not compatible with the direction that 20th century commercial aviation chose. That direction led to safety and accessibility and the democratization of travel, which are genuinely great achievements. But they are achievements built on the assumption that the aircraft is primarily a transportation device, and that any comfort or beauty it offers is a secondary feature rather than the primary point. The G.38 was built on the opposite assumption, and because that assumption did not prevail, the experience it offered, the wing cabin, the forward windows, the downward view through the floor, the specific quality of being carried inside a wing above Europe, is simply gone. Not improved upon, not replaced by something better. Gone. Specific to those few years, those 2 aircraft, those few hundred passengers who happened to sit in those chairs and look through those windows. An experience as unrepeatable as a conversation, as irretrievable as a morning. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves attention before we bring the journey to its close. It is the dimension of what the G.38 tells us about Germany in that particular moment between the wars. A Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s was a country conducting a complicated negotiation with its own recent past and its uncertain future. The First World War had been catastrophic. The treaty that ended it had been humiliating. The inflation of the early 1920s had been economically and psychologically devastating. The Weimar Republic, fragile and contested, was attempting to build a democratic, modern, internationally engaged Germany on foundations that had been deeply shaken. And yet, in that atmosphere of difficulty and instability, German science and German engineering were producing work of extraordinary ambition and quality. The Bauhaus, the developments in modern architecture, the achievements of German physics and chemistry, and aviation, with Junkers and Dornier and Heinkel and the other great names of German aeronautical engineering, producing aircraft that were, in purely technical terms, among the most advanced in the world. The G.38 belonged to this constellation of achievement. It was not merely an aircraft, it was an argument made in aluminum and glass and leather that Germany was a civilized nation, a technically sophisticated nation, a nation capable of the finest things. Lufthansa understood this argument and embraced it. Its flagship routes, flown by its most impressive aircraft, were exercises in soft power as much as commercial aviation. When the G.38 landed at Croydon, passengers disembarking from its extraordinary wing cabins carried with them an impression of Germany that no diplomatic communiqué could have created so vividly. The impression of a country that built beautiful, enormous, technically masterful things and used them to carry people across a peaceful Europe in comfort and wonder. That story did not end well. The Germany that built the G.38 was already beginning, in the early 1930s, to shade into something different, something darker, something that would within a decade consume the aircraft and the airline and the civilization of peaceful European air travel in a catastrophe that makes the loss of the G-38's extraordinary wing cabins seem a very small grief indeed. But the aircraft itself, in the years it flew, embodied a genuine aspiration, the aspiration to make the world smaller and more connected through aviation, to demonstrate that human beings could build things of extraordinary capability and use them with elegance rather than merely with efficiency. That aspiration deserves to be remembered, and it deserves to be remembered not as a technical footnote or a museum exhibit, but as a genuine achievement of the human imagination, a vision of what flight could be that was briefly, gloriously, heartbreakingly real. Before I let you go, I want you to sit with one final image. It is sometime in 1932 or 1933. The second G-38 is somewhere over northern France, en route from Berlin to London. The weather has cleared after a grey morning, and the sky ahead, visible through the forward windows of the right-wing route cabin, is a pale, extraordinary blue. Below, through the floor panels, France arranges itself in the afternoon light, the long, straight roads that the Romans built and the French maintained, the geometry of agricultural land, the dark marks of forests, the occasional smudge of a town. A river catches the sun and flashes silver for a moment before sliding out of the frame. In the cabin, 2 passengers, a man and a woman from the photograph that survives, though who they were is no longer known. They are dressed as people dressed for important journeys in 1932, with the particular care and formality that the era demanded. They are sitting in their wide upholstered chairs, looking out, not talking in this moment, just looking. At the sky ahead, at the earth below, at the extraordinary fact of their own suspension inside a wing above a continent. And on the small table between them is a coffee cup, still half full. The steward is elsewhere in the aircraft. The 4 engines hum through the structure around them, their sound filtered by the aluminum, and the mass and the engineering into something almost serene. The wing above them and around them contains them like a held breath. In a few hours they will land. The journey will be over. They will collect their luggage and pass through customs and go on to wherever they were going, to meetings or visits or whatever purpose brought them to London. And they will carry with them, for the rest of their lives, the memory of this, looking out through the leading edge of a wing at a Europe that was still, in this particular afternoon, at peace. That is the Junkers G.38. That is what it felt like to travel inside it. That is why, nearly a century later, it still matters. So here we are at the end of this journey. We have walked the apron at Tempelhof. We have sat inside the wing. We have looked out through forward windows at a pre-war Europe that no longer exists in any form, not in geography, not in politics, not in the quality of attention it received from the sky. We have felt the hum of 4 engines through the floor of a cabin that should not have existed in 1930, and somehow, miraculously, did. And I want to leave you with a question, because questions are the thing that keeps history alive. If the G-38 had not been lost to the economics of efficiency and the catastrophe of war, if the thick wing, inhabitable structure approach to aircraft design had continued and developed, what might commercial aviation look like today? Might we, in some alternative version of this story, be flying in aircraft where the wing itself is a destination, where forward observation lounges and floor-level windows and the specific, extraordinary experience of being carried inside a wing are still available, still real, still part of what it means to travel at altitude across the surface of this planet? I suspect we would fly very differently if that question had been answered differently. I suspect that travel, for those who value the journey as much as the destination, would feel less like an inconvenience and more like an occasion. And I suspect that somewhere in the memory of those few hundred passengers who sat in those wing cabins and looked out through those forward windows, there is a testimony that we have not yet fully heard. A testimony about what flight can be when it chooses to be more than transport. The Junkers G.38 chose to be more than transport. For a few extraordinary years, above a world that was still briefly at peace, it succeeded. If this journey into history resonated with you, if it gave you that feeling of standing at the edge of something remarkable that no longer exists but somehow still matters, then I would be genuinely grateful if you would share this video with others who love history, who love the golden age of aviation, who appreciate the culture of refined travel and the extraordinary things that human beings built when they still believed that beauty was as important as efficiency. Share it with the friend who flies first class and would have killed for a wing cabin seat in 1932. And share it with the history enthusiast who already knows everything about the great ocean liners, but hasn't yet heard about the aircraft that tried to be one. And if you'd like to keep exploring stories like this one, stories of impossible aircraft, vanished luxury, and the golden era of travel when the journey truly was the destination, then subscribe to the channel. There is so much more to discover, so many more extraordinary aircraft, so many more experiences that felt, to those who had them, like the future, and feel to us, looking back, like a dream we can almost but never quite remember having. Leave me a comment below. Tell me, if you could have chosen one seat on the Junkers G.38, where would you have sat? The wing cabin, looking forward through those impossible windows? Or would you have chosen the conventional fuselage seats, watching the wing itself from the outside, aware of what it contained, content to be part of the same extraordinary experience from a different angle? I'm curious, and I will see you on the next flight.